Hello. How's it going? Well, this is a talk that I have that essentially goes over, as the name would imply, the stuff that surrounds getting DevOps started. So I go out and talk with a lot of large organizations, and I've done that for many years. And most of what I talk with them about, to put it one kind of snarky way, is usually go into a room of people and they want to improve how they're doing things. Maybe it's y'all later this week. You'll go back to work after your fun DevOps days thing. And you want to change things and do them better. And then it's usually like managers and enterprise architects, and they're really good at whiteboards. What they're really good at is listing all the reasons why they suck and they can't actually do anything, and why their organization is terrible and the hurdles they have to get over. And so I find that what people need some sort of solace around is, in organizations, how are they actually getting over the hurdles that allow them to even think about DevOps teams and all of the multiple pizzas that you need and the blameless postmortems and all of these great sounding things. And so what I've collected together here, and what I spend a lot of time talking about when I go out and talk with people, is what those barriers are and how people should start thinking about what IT does and how they can sort of like, I don't know, whether it's clear a field or pave a road or meditate and clear their mind, but make it such that their organization can actually do things in a better way. So there's slides down there if you like collecting slides. Also, if you go to my Twitter account at just Cote, C-O-T-E, I just posted them there, so that might be faster to type. Whatever you like. Oh. Sorry, I had a little lav mic, so I thought you could hear me.
That's just for the camera.
Okay, sounds great. Well, let me take this mic here. I'll double fist it. So, is this better for everyone? I don't have that dude from yesterday shouting that he can't hear me.
Testing. It went off. We got to check this.
No problem. I wouldn't want you to miss my scintillating talk about myself, so I'll just pause. All right, that's a little loud there. Let me figure this out. So there I am. When I travel, I like to eat the regional cuisine. There I was in Omaha. They didn't call it a tomahawk steak, but that's what we call it back home in Austin. So I work at Pivotal. I spend a lot of time doing exactly what I said, going out and talking with people, and kind of in a consultative, I'm on the advocate team. You might think of them as evangelists. But we go out and just talk with people and try to, make them realize that the way they're operating should change a little bit such that they would want to buy our stuff. That's essentially what you do in marketing and as an evangelist. I've been an industry analyst several places over the years at 451 Research and Red Monk. That's a fun thing to do, cover infrastructure software there, write up reports, talk with people. And I live down in Austin, so you have to do basically at least a 2-year term at Dell, where in an indirect way I now work again. But I worked in corporate strategy and M&A there on software and cloud. If you ever get a chance to work with MBAs, you can really brush up on your PowerPoint and Excel macros. It's a great environment. But it was fun to work on that. And combined together with having been a software developer for about 10 years before that, it gives me, I don't really have any hobbies, excitingly, for my wife and kids, except following IT. So it's nice to see it from all these different angles and how things work out. And I put out a lot of content. As mentioned before, I think we're a media sponsor here. You could have gotten 25% off by using the code SDT.com. If you listen to Software Defined Talk, which is more or less a weekly thing, and I do a podcast for Pivotal, you can find all the stuff that I do, including links to the register column that I write over at Cote.io. So that's just a brief introduction to me. I've now established my authority to speak on these topics. So not to be outdone, I'm sure you're like, come to Charlotte, talk about the food you've eaten in Omaha. What's up with your regional insult? Well, as I was reminding someone yesterday, if you go to the Charlotte airport, right, this is what I would like to say about food around here. You have like 5 to 6 types of pimento cheese in the airport. Like, I can't even fathom, if I were to go to an actual like artisanal store around here, how many varieties of pimento cheese there would be. Like, if there's 5 in the airport, there must be like 20 that you can get somewhere else. So I, of course, selected the blue cheese pimento cheese. I mean, there was jalapeno, but being from Texas, like, I don't want to make that situation happen. But this is delicious. Look at this close-up. It's got pimentos in it. It was very good. It went well watching a little bit of the Super Bowl and trying to figure out how the sports ball works. But that's what I would recommend. If you're going through the airport, get yourself some pimento cheese. So I like to start off with sort of motivation for why we care about a lot of these things. So it's fun to sort of like be into IT for the sake of IT and enjoy the shiny objects and things like that. But it's also good to have what people might call business motivation. And if you're in the nonprofit industries, government, your motivations are more or less the same. You have this kind of imperative to do more with IT, as they say, to actually look at IT as a way that you're modeling and changing the way your business operates. And a lot of this is summed up, a lot of things going on is in this great quote from one of the senior executives at Citi. Now, as I'm talking, read through this and think like, I'm pretty sure when you get an MBA, they use like a Ludovico treatment to make you never say the word fail and things like that. So it's phenomenal that you see discussion like this coming out from an executive. But a lot of this arises from sort of studies that you see, just to summarize one of them. It used to be the case when you look at the ability for a company to stay on top, to make profits and kind of live fat and happy, that if you were on the S&P 500, right, just one arbitrary way of rating the success of companies in the 1900s, that's last century for all you millennials out there, like essentially you could stay up there for about 60 years or so. And the apex of it was in the 1960s, you could be like that guy Juan Trippe at Pan Am, or like, you know, all these people who were just like, could stay up there and reap profits. But if you fast forward a little while and you project out to just a few years from now to 2020, the average is going to be about 12 years or so that you can stay on top. So all what that means is that it's extremely competitive and hard for a business to stay up there. And there's many reasons for this. There's like, you know, globalism you can take advantage of, and there's lots of mergers and acquisitions going on as regulations rise and fall and things like that. But a significant contributor to this churn is IT, essentially. And if you think about, usually in a presentation like this, there's a bunch of logos of like Airbnb and Uber and Tesla and things like that. But think about all these companies, and even larger companies, that are essentially using IT to dramatically change how their business operates, how their business models are, and to even threaten incumbents and also protect themselves, right? I always think back to, because I worked on online banking, because it's kind of an older thing, but think about how crazy that was to pay a bill online versus having to like mail a check. And that is another thing that was driven by IT, essentially. And now in every single industry, there's this need for companies to be more innovative. And as this quote gets to, they're looking towards IT to provide that source of innovation, right? I mean, they're not going to get a lot of great innovation by sort of like making sure that they're getting a better deal on paper, or that their coffee machines are networked, or things like that, right? They need to actually create something that's different and unique to their business that retains and gets them new customers. So they're yearning for IT to help them out. So it's pretty good if you're in the IT department, as I assume most of you are. Otherwise, I'm not really sure why you're here. That to look at how we're doing and do a health check of how we're doing things. Now, this is one survey that I've kind of plucked out of all the stuff that I look at. And you know, it has this terrible phrase that I'm sure many of you don't like, digital. Like, I always think, what is digital? You know, makes me wonder what analog is. But you know, it's a good survey saying, if you're in this environment where IT is expected to do new things and innovate, how is that strategy going at your company? What are you actually doing? And I'll let you do the math, because I have a philosophy degree, so I always bungle up math. But if you add this up, there's sort of like anywhere from, let's say, like 25 to 40% of people are actually doing something about all of this. They're actually trying to be helpful and putting some plans into place, which, you know, and actually if you take that 18% out, if I remember, they're sort of like, they're starting it, which essentially says that people in the IT department are not really up to the task, and they're not really in the throes that they need to be, commiserate to what their organizations want them to do. They're probably just now figuring out that moving to Office 365 is a good idea. And they're very happy that the CEO can now check email on his personal device, his or her, I should say. So we have this problem where we need IT to be more innovative, to catch up with new ways of doing things, and they're really not up to the task in aggregate. Now, I'm sure everyone in this room, you're doing great. You're probably in that 22% slice of the pie. So when you go talk with your friends, you can understand why they're depressed, maybe buy them a round of beer with the large S of your success here. But it's good motivation to figure out improving the way that you do IT. So this is like this comes from a lot of conversations that I have when I go out and talk with people. And so they really want to improve the way IT is done. And I noticed that they're sort of like, they have some basic remedial work that they need to do first before they can, get to the advanced things like DevOps. Like, as numerous speakers at DevOps days will attest to, before you can get to the blameless postmortem, you really need to have like a very good cultural shift and lots of understanding. And getting to the point where you can do that metaphoric hand-holding stuff like takes a lot of work from where we currently are, right? So what I'm going to go over is first an idea of how you should actually think about IT, what's valuable, and how the misperceptions of it. And then I'll go through a sort of a laundry list of the common problems people have in trying to whether it's doing DevOps or doing Agile, or as we say at Pivotal, cloud native. There's all these great phrases, or digital transformation, but basically just improving the way that you use IT at your organization. So the first thing is, and this is what I encounter the most, is people think about IT as mostly a grocery store. They think, I've got some problem. I'm going to go to the magic IT land, maybe some horrific ticket system, or I'll have staff go to a horrific ticket system for me, and I'm just going to request something. I'm going to go get whatever milk I want. I mean, they're all pretty much the same. I just get one that's cheapest and functional, and then boom, I'm done, right? Like I've got my bag of goods that I need. And in a grocery store, you're getting something off the shelf, and in the IT world, we have this metaphor that you have off-the-shelf IT, right? Just ready-made applications that you install. And maybe in the late 80s, when other people didn't have ERP systems and couldn't schedule conference rooms, like that was a competitive advantage to have. But really, like everyone's got that stuff. You're not going to get a lot of innovation and differentiation by just getting off-the-shelf things, right? Instead, what you need to do is think of more of being like in a kitchen or a restaurant, to continue a very painful metaphor. In the sense that you're creating things that are unique to you. You're using IT to create custom stuff that only you have. And I don't know about you, but what that means to me is basically software development. Writing your own software, running your own software, changing it as much as possible to really not only sort of like have neat features like being able to view things on your mobile phone, but actually instrument and drive what the business can do, right? Like, again, to go back to it, like being able to do mobile deposits is kind of like a fascinating thing. I can deposit the rent checks that I get from my tenants like without going to the bank. And like that's all enabled by doing, that's probably off-the-shelf stuff, poor example. But think about all of the sorts of things that you can do if you could write software kind of on a weekly basis that matched the businesses that you had. So if you accept this premise that doing custom software is a good way to help do innovation, this is like the second rung of misunderstanding that I encounter. And if you're like me in the 80s, you watched a lot of Army movies, military movies, especially like the submarine movies. And there's this pivotal scene in every submarine movie where like something's broken, and they go into that with a tiny table in the officer's mess. And they just swipe the tea or coffee, depending on what part of the Cold War they're on, off of it. And they roll out this big schematic. And they're like, all we have to do, Captain, is send someone into the reactor and move this little knob, and everything will be fine, the plot can progress. Now, a lot of people think about software as this way. Like, we've got this existing software stack, and all we need to do is install this one piece of software, and we've got 20% optimization and save the company. And if you ever worked on software, it doesn't work that way at all. Often what you're doing is basically recoding the whole submarine, or you might be like, what we actually need is a coffee machine or a hot air balloon. Like, you're continually reinventing what it is you're actually doing. You're not just tweaking this existing thing that you have. So once we get over these ideas of what IT is, and these may seem ridiculous to people here, but pretty much on a weekly basis, I have to go over this with people to kind of drive them to what's valuable with IT and what IT isn't. And it's not really their fault. It's not like us nerds are good at explaining what we do. But these are the two ways to reorient yourself to think what we need to do, what DevOps and other things like that are supporting is getting custom written software out the door. So if we think about that, what we're driving towards is getting that software out the door. The next thing that we need to figure out is what's sort of like the process and the mindset that we're trying to put in place. What are we trying to accomplish? So everyone knows about the waterfall sort of agile dichotomy, if dichotomy is the right word. You often hear things like Wagile fall and water scrum fall and all these sorts of things. And they're interesting, instructive ways of thinking about it. But the way that I like to think about the goal of how you do software is you're trying to get a small batch process in place. Now, if you're a big reader of the internet and DevOps and Agile stuff, you probably come across all sorts of things, right? Like a lot of this is stolen from learnings in lean manufacturing, and there's also, if you like, if you're one of these military people, if you like that, what's the guy, Colonel Boyd, your OODA loop, or you've got in lean your PDCA loop, plan, do, check, act. Or if you're a classicist, there's a scientific method. But all of it revolves around the idea that you've got a problem in front of your face. You come up with some theory of how you might solve it. You have to test if that theory is accurate, and then study the results and repeat the cycle again. So I think of this as a small batch process, and the key with what you're trying to enable now is you're trying to do that on a weekly turn. And the way you experiment is you actually deploy to production to users and observe how they're using it and correct your software accordingly. Now, I'll give you that all sounds like wonderful and what we all should be doing, right? And meanwhile, when you go back to work, you can update your Word documents to sort of reflect the new way you should be operating, your big MRDs and everything. But let me give you one example that kind of illustrates that. So probably most everyone here is familiar with the IRS, who we pay our taxes to. So there's this thing that if you don't pay your taxes on time, they charge you daily a penalty, which is unfortunate. I guess it's good for the rest of us, we get more money. But it's unfortunate for them, and so people are highly motivated to go look up how much money they owe. Now, normally, before they introduced some software here, you'd have like a call center, and it was always overrun because we never want to give the IRS enough money to do their job. I don't know if that's ironic or just vengeful. Running those teleconference things, the phone things are bad, and someone did a study that 30% of the time you would just get a courtesy disconnect. They would just hang up on you because they were overloaded. So someone thought, hey, computers, that's a good idea. So they wanted to introduce a web UI, they probably call it a portal, that you would go to and look up how much taxes you owned. And being accountants, just like engineers, they were like, we've got this maximum data set, so let's let them peruse their entire relationship with the IRS. They can relive the memories, like moments and photos. And so in one of their first iterations, they deployed this maximal UI, and people are still confused, and because they put it in front of users and studied it, they figured out that people still wanted to call up the call centers, right? So a total failure of their software. So they went through several revs of it, and they discovered, and again, this stuff is always obvious once you discover it, that when people want to know how much they owe the IRS, all they want to know is how much they owe the IRS. So they had a simplified UI that just displayed that, and then people didn't want to call the call centers anymore. But they got to this by following a small batch process, doing it week by week, incrementally, putting it in front of users and studying it. Now, in contrast, you would expect like an 8 or 9 or 12-month cycle where they would put the first rev there, and maybe 3 or 4 months at best later they could fix it, right? But because they assured that they have this small batch process in place, because they could deploy weekly, and because things worked, and they had the product design mentality behind it, they were able to actually succeed at this, lower their costs, and now you know how much money you owe the IRS if you decided not to pay last year. So the question you have is essentially like, how do we get to the point where we can release software weekly and it actually works? Now, I forget if the Charlotte people sent this, but usually when you presented these things, you're sent a quota of memes that you have to have in here. You always need to have something about silos, Conway's Law, pizza, and cats are bonus points. And I added a taco just for your enjoyment. So, there's a lot of talks that go over how you actually operate that and what DevOps is, and sure, you got to break down silos and all of that nonsense. So that's great stuff. I don't want to take that thunder from other presenters, and look at that adorable cat. Hopefully he's jumping on some grounds there. But it is true, like all of the stuff that you might read in the DevOps handbook or effective DevOps or these other things are the end goal of what you want to get to. But let's discuss how you can get to that point, how you can get over common hurdles that I encounter. And I like to think of that, when I go out and talk with people, they're expert at following what I like to call the stop hitting yourself anti-pattern. Like they're very upset at themselves, and another good metaphor is they're a bunch of Eeyores, it's not much of an IT department, but I'm sort of attached to it. Like they really need to cheer up and stop hitting themselves and try to fix the way that they're doing things instead of perseverating over why they suck, to use that phrase earlier. So the first thing, and I'm going to go through about, if I remember, like 4 or so things, sort of like the hurdles that you need to get over. And I'll put a link to this at the end, but all of these are written up, and we just finished copy editing this it's like 60-page or so book that details out a lot more of these topics than other ones. But the first thing, and usually this is great to present to people because there's usually more staff than managers, so now's your chance to make fun of managers and laugh at their foibles, because so far from annual reviews, it's fine to do that. But the first thing that of note when you're trying to transform over how you're doing software is it's critical for management to realize that they need to change as much as the individual staff, right? This is where you get your Wagile fall and your water scrum fall problems, is everyone focuses on the team and the team needs to change. But it's very rare that management focuses on changing themselves. And so this is Matt Curry at Allstate, a friend of mine. We do some podcasts together, and he has several great presentations over if you want to do all of this DevOps, Agile, Cloud Native stuff, all of the small and big tactics that they've followed at Allstate to make that successful. And one of the first things, sort of a mindset, there's all sorts of tactics to live there, but I just want to say 2 things. One of the first things is this mindset of, as a manager, you're usually doing what I think of as Christmas tree meetings. You go into this meeting and everything's red, yellow, or green. It's like the status of things. How's it going? Is it on budget over time? And you spend all your time talking about red stuff, and you've got this obligatory nod to green stuff to supposedly make people happy about their life. But you're really just focused on that Christmas tree stuff. And if you think about the goal of a small batch approach or of DevOps, of being a learning organization, What you really should be doing as a manager is driving that change by asking people what they've learned in this release, what their new theories are, kind of getting into the details of how they're going to be improving the product, not just checking on the Christmas tree lights, which are like terrible to diagnose if you've ever tried to fix Christmas tree lights. And so that's one of the first things that management needs to go through is changing the way they manage, in the same way that the team is going to change the way they're doing team things. Now, another thing is you think through this, I don't know if it's a metaphor or sort of a literal thing, if you will, but management itself needs to start using a small batch process to program the organization and experiment with new ways of organizing teams, new ways of organizing the whole staffing and setting up the organization, and see if they work and be adaptable to changing things around and if they figure out what works in their organization. And again, I refer you to the many great talks of Matt Curry to go over that process that they went through and some of the things they ended up that works in their organization. So next, kind of hearkening back to that snarky tweet of mine, the other thing, which may sound obvious, but then you go talk with people and you look at surveys, is there's a lot of people who don't have, I don't know, it's about a 20-year-old technology, you might have heard of it, called continuous integration. And there's somewhere around half to 60% of organizations who are, I don't know, I guess they've got like that good, what was that book, Peopleware? They're just now finishing up Peopleware, maybe that rapid stuff. Back when Microsoft was leading the height of how you do development, they're figuring out how to right-click in rational rows and extract some diagrams. It's awesome stuff. But essentially there's a lot of organizations who aren't actually doing continuous integration. And of course, I don't know, maybe it's not of course, but it should become obvious that if you don't have continuous integration in place, you should just not start, right? Like none of the stuff that we talk about at DevOps Days is really going to be effective or interesting except the off-topic things. Like if you're not running CI, you're not ever going to get to continuous delivery, which an even smaller amount of people actually do. And so it's really vital that if you're not doing this, you stop everything and put that in place. Now, on the other hand, Pivotal is also hiring, so if you're going to give up on that organization, you can talk to me. We get a nice little referral bonus. They lowered it this year, but what are you going to do? We got to pay attention to the EBIT. And a lot of what we're going to talk about in the hurdles you get over, especially with compliance and people who don't trust software developers, gets ironed over with the trust that continuous integration builds, as you can see from the quote from Liberty Mutual. This is also fills my personal quota of breaking every single law about presentations in a slide with dense text and not asking people to use their images, things like that. So I can tick that one off. So as I mentioned, continuous integration helps you with compliance and auditors and other Dr. No people. So this is the other area that when people are trying to improve the way they're doing software that comes up all the time and that people struggle with. I think a lot of that struggling gets down to they don't want to go talk to auditors because they seem like weird, funny people who sort of are operating on a alternate reality of facts about how software operates. But there's these walls of three-ring binders that people are encountering and they're fearful of. And as with security and project management and all sorts of other things, the thing about this is that when you actually go to auditors and explain to them that if we have continuous integration in place, we're using Git so we can track every single thing that people checked in. We have a cloud platform that logs and says who did what, where, and we can roll things back. If you think about all of the audit trail that's automated off of that, and if you spend a little bit of time to maybe, like as some people in the federal government have been doing, to output some documents that are friendly for the auditors, they come to realize this great thing that, so HCSC is, they run, I think in 5 states they run the Blue Cross Blue Shields there. They realize this thing that Mark there said nicely is that when you go to auditors, just remind them they can put whatever they want in a Word doc, right? But you can't really falsify that whole audit trail. I mean, I guess you could, but the effort you would put in would far outweigh the benefit you would get from it. It'd be very hard to falsify and timestamp all of that stuff. So once you bring that to auditors, they usually are much more happy and excited about the fact that you have this automated process in place and that you're following a regular process and that can be verified and checked on. And there's other approvals and PCI junk that you have to do, but most of that stuff is actually just like you got to read a really boring document and figure out how it applies to you. So compliance and auditing stuff isn't as big a deal as it may seem. It's yet another human problem where just ask your manager for a little lunch budget, maybe buy some fancy bottles of liquor and start hanging out with the auditors and explain to them how things are operating. Like if developers and operators can get together, surely you can talk with auditors. So another hurdle that people encounter is you hear this a lot, especially when it comes to acquiring a server. They'll be like, oh, it takes us 3 months to get a server because we got to fill out a ticket, and if you don't fill out the ticket right, they reject it, and then you make this science, You've got this criminology of how to fill out tickets, and usually that means there's an outsourcer involved. And the problem with outsourcers is like they're really, really good at delivering you exactly what you wanted 5 years ago. And you see this in surveys, that they're not very adaptable. The contracts that you put in place, the SLAs they have to meet, the functions that they're doing, how they operate so they have their own good profit margins, like it results in, if you're changing around the way you're doing IT and you expect it to be a source of innovation, very unsatisfying. Now, I'm going to talk about legacy next, and similar to legacy, there are not a lot of excellent answers to what you do with your existing mess, but there are some coping tactics. One of them is to figure out a way of essentially quarantining or isolating, which is to say making an API out of whatever it is your outsourcers are providing for you. Like, it's not crazy to hear people who've written like a little chef or puppet script to like open up a ticket. Like, that's a very common thing that I encounter. But the other thing is to start doing what a lot of large organizations I talk with are doing, you know, in the federal government, at places like Citi and all sorts of other places that are sort of, don't always go on the record about it, but they're looking to insource the staff that they have going forward rather than outsourcing. And you know, we see this down in Austin. There's thousands of jobs that people like GM and Home Depot are hiring in data centers down there to do development and programming and insourcing lots of the IT that they have. But the point is, again, there's not really any great bromides for how to cure these ills, but going forward, you really should, unless you're dealing with a very weird boutique outsourcing firm, it's much better to insource things if you're looking to IT to be a source of innovation for you. So speaking of that, legacy is another annoying issue. Now, legacy is another issue where it kind of follows my principle of, you know, you only need to floss the teeth you want to keep. And, you know, to use another term, right, like the best time to plant a tree is yesterday, barring that today is a good idea. And legacy management is like that, right? Like, legacy is usually software that is very mission critical, as they used to say, makes a lot of money, but for some reason you need to change and you're deathly afraid to do it, like for whatever reason. Otherwise, you would just call it your software, right? Software that you're happy to change, no one ever calls legacy. Now, the issue that you have if you're worrying about your legacy is someone sort of missed the ball of enterprise architecture of keeping up with the portfolio, or maybe people haven't been following the wonderful advice from the ivory tower. So the first step to do is to make sure that you have some kind of portfolio management in place that's being enforced, right? Again, start flossing today if you forgot to do it yesterday. And so you get all your enterprise architects in a room, maybe give them an open bar and sort of say, like, what have you people been doing around here? Let's figure out managing your portfolio so they won't have legacy problems. Now, you can also do things like find some of the low-hanging fruit and see if you virtualized it yet to kind of not worry about it. See if you can move things to a SaaS instead of doing it in-house, kind of free up resources that you have. And then there's all sorts of great ways that you can talk about what we used to call in the Gang of 4 Days a facade, or essentially wrapping an API around something, and you can follow some practice that's well documented called the strangler pattern, which doesn't really fix things automatically. It's not like a submarine, right? But it does give you the option to pretend like this old horky thing is operating in a new way and lets you at your own pace more or less change it and rewrite it over. But at the end of the day, other than putting good portfolio management in place, most large organizations I encounter, what they end up having to do is basically rewrite the stuff. Like, if they don't know what it is, it's usually a lot more cheaper and less risky instead of just coding it and understanding it to go in and rewrite the old systems that they have, which is a lot of where the strangler and API stuff comes into play. But the important thing is to figure out making sure that problem doesn't happen again. So last thing, wrapping up, is if you think about all the technologies that we've talked about here and that are kind of implied by the ability to release software every day and essentially study how it's using, there's essentially a platform that you end up having in place. Now, I noticed that a lot of people are excited about building their big old batch of container kudzu, all that sorts of stuff. Like, they really love building their own platform. I used to build platforms when I was a developer. It's a great thing to do in your 20s. But you've got kind of like all of these components that you're going to need for the software that you're running, right? And this is an amalgamation of organizations we've talked with, our own work, and just other people. And it's kind of an averaging, I guess, of like all of the stuff that you need with the platform. So if you want to get to this point where you're delivering every week and therefore improving the way you do software, make sure you're planning that out, because what you're going to end up building is a product, right? It's not just a one-time project that you do. It's not like bringing up a virtualization cluster, but you're going to be building out a product. And, you know, as all these little logos go, there's lots of different little components that you can tie together, and you're gonna have to configure them and make sure they work, and then they might get upgraded, and you gotta patch them, and then you're also gonna have to manage all of this stuff. And again, this is just kind of an averaging out of like all those different components. If you tie them together and you have teams dedicated to them, it's somewhere, you know, around like 50 people or so. And if you use a calculation of a very low overhead, like 140,000 all in, now that doesn't include your sriracha cashews and chunky coconut water and scooters and stuff. That's extra. But if you do that calculation, you know, it's probably going to take you a couple of years to get it to where you trust it in production, and you're looking at $14 million or so. So make sure you plan that out. I didn't go over the finance part, but you're going to want to go talk with them. Now, of course, I've learned that unless you're Docker, AWS, Chef, Puppet, whatever Vagrant is, things like that, you can't actually mention commercial products of this, so I've redacted this slide. But if you're interested in the secret behind here, you can come over to the Pivotal booth, and we'll give you an alternative to building your own platform. So finally, and when you get towards the end of this, people are a little like slightly jaundiced, but they're a little more encouraged. And they want to know how they get started with things. Like, how do I start out the plan for getting to this point where I'm improving the way that I'm doing software so I can deliver on that DevOps strategy or that cloud strategy that my manager told me to go investigate 3 to 6 months ago. So the first thing that I hear that's a warning sign is like, you know what we're going to do first thing is do the .com site, which is a terrible idea. That's going to go very bad. Right? You should not pick the biggest, most important, highly visible thing that probably is the worst architected piece of junk that your company is being mega successful based on, right? That's the very definition of legacy. And instead, this is something pulled from a talk that Home Depot gave. And you can see the curve over about a year or so of the number of applications as represented by the subcomponents that they did. And you can see they start small, right? They start with a series of small projects. They're not science projects. It's not like a new way to schedule conference rooms. But they are projects that are low complexity based on risk and size, but are actually real projects used in their environment. Like some of the early examples that they used were improving the way that the paint desk runs and the tool rental business runs, right? Those are, as they say, material businesses, significant businesses, but they're small enough that they're not going to bring down the whole company. So you do all of these little projects, and you're not only learning the technology, but you're taking the small batch approach to learn how to organize, learn how to approach this. And you're also building up a series of wins that you basically internal market to the rest of the organization to get the trust to change doing things, right? To get over all those Dr. No's that you have. So there's all sorts of methodologies for doing that, but it's really good to start a lot smaller than you probably think you should, which is going to be exciting when your vendor comes and shows you a bill. But it's, you know, you got to think that you're going to exponentially grow as you're successful at doing things. So I'm already a few minutes over, but that's kind of a brief summary of some of the things that I have. Here's we don't have the fancy PDF yet, but if you want to read more, and there's some stuff that I left out. If you right now you can get it lead gen free because we don't have the fancy PDF. You can just go right to the Google Doc where we're working on it. If you go to cote.io/cloud2, you can find my more extensive write-up of all of this stuff. And you know, other than enjoying the fact that people like read my stuff and either complain or what about it, like any eyeball is a good eyeball in my book. I really am interested in the stories and reactions that people out there have. Like basically all I do for my job is listen to what other people say and then turn around and spit it back out in a snarky way to other folks. So I need that raw material coming in on this side. So with that, I always like to end my presentation with this thing from the Agile Manifesto, because it's what I think I've ended up being interested in, and definitely the team I'm on does, and Pivotal as a whole. And you know, there's a lot of subtlety in this short quote. I mean, the main thing is like to figure out how to do software better. But what I would ask of people out there is that happens very rarely, is as you figure these things out, look at the last part, right? It's good to like go out there and actually tell people what you figured out, what works and doesn't work. Because spreading that knowledge is what's going to help all of us figure things out, right? Most people work at organizations that everyone operates with or that have a huge footprint, especially in the government. And if you think about the footprint that better software would have in most everyone's life, like just improving it a few percentage points would make everyone's lives better. And we need to share that knowledge out more broadly so we, you know, suck less at software, essentially. So I don't know if the organizers want to give time for questions, but you can get the slides and you can ask me more questions. But thanks for having me.